Hello and welcome to episode 99 of Linux Dev Time. I'm Joe.
I'm Amalith.
I'm Kevin.
And I'm Andy.
Good to talk to you all again. Today we're going to talk about forks. Now this is a fundamental aspect of open source software, the ability to take it and fork it and make it your own thing. But is it necessarily the best idea to always do that? We should probably attempt to answer that question at some point. But first, what exactly is a fork?
So a fork is just a copy of the source code. You copy it, and then you can make changes on your own. With GitHub, that became super popular because they put the green fork button right in the top right-hand corner, which was also required for any kind of a pull request where you make an exact copy of the repository you're forking. You make your changes, and then you can issue your pull request back to the original in order for them to accept your changes or not. However, in this case, if you're just forking and going your own way, you're going your own way. You're making your changes and moving on.
So when would you want to do a fork then?
Well, there's a whole bunch of different reasons why you may want to fork. Some of them are socio-political or governance differences. Others are purely technical. You want to go in a direction that the upstream does not want to go. Some of them are bug fixes that the upstream is either not willing to patch. Maybe the bug doesn't actually affect them. Or it could just be because you want to build something based on said work. There's all kinds of different reasons to want to fork a project.
Yeah, some of them are friendly and some of them are unfriendly. So, I have this secret plan that someone is going to take AntennaPod and fork it and make it into a video player because I would love to have exactly AntennaPod but for videos. And that could be a completely friendly fork, right? Because AntennaPod is obviously not for videos. So if you want to use all that amazing work they've done to make that program but use it for a different purpose, then no one's going to get annoyed about that.
I thought you were going to say, take AntennaPod and fork it and bring back the refresh button.
But yeah, most of the forks that we hear about are quite grumpy, right? They're because of some kind of disagreement, and there's all different kinds. So we heard recently about various forks of Redis because the Redis project changed its license to a license that's not an open source approved license. So there are multiple forks now that are creating a version of that project under different open source licenses.
Which kind of brings us into the difference between a soft fork and a hard fork.
Yeah, so between the two, a soft fork and a hard fork is where you fork the code and you go in your own way. You make your changes and you just move on as your own independent project. A soft fork is where you may add a feature or fix a bug. You do something, but you still track the upstream changes. So whenever the upstream makes a new commit or a new change, you take that into your own soft fork as well. Now, these can either be public soft forks in which you're tracking the changes of the upstream, but also maintaining your own patches, or what's, in my experience, pretty common for private industries. They'll make a soft fork of a project and maintain their own internal private patches, but continue to track the upstream for all of the other work and maintenance.
Why would you do that, though?
At least the places that I've worked before, we've had different features or bugs that we needed fixed on a timeline that we had, and the upstream either wasn't willing or sometimes just not around to do the things at the speed we needed. So it was easier to do a soft fork, maintain our private patches until upstream either accepted them or was ready for them. And then as soon as our private patches were merged into the main upstream, we then delete our soft fork and we go back to using the upstream. That's pretty common within the industry, at least from what I've seen.
Yeah, and it can just be like a different approach or a different feel. So there's quite a friendly fork of Element Web, which is a project I've worked on, which is called Shieldy Chat, which is it's a combination of pull requests that might eventually get into Element Web, but Element Web people are still thinking about it or wanting tests for them or that kind of thing. But also there's an attitude on that project of we don't care if there's a lot of settings. We just want everything that people might want.
Well, the KDE.
Exactly, the KDE approach. So if Element Web removes features, then Shieldy Chat will kind of bring them back again and put them behind a config option.
And it's not just a case of fork the code, that's it. You're taking on the burden of maintaining it, right? After you've forked it.
Especially for a hard fork, yeah.
Yeah, I don't think people initially realize how difficult a fork can be in the real world. Because one, there's a lot of mindshare with the original project. And it turns out after you fork, especially if you're doing a hard fork and you want to go your own separate ways, you have to capture the mindshare of the audience. And sometimes that happens organically, but other times it doesn't. But that also means that all of the work that the upstream either was doing or may even continue to do, you now also need to do yourself or with your own project and community which can be a ton of work, especially if you're trying to maintain feature parity with the upstream, a la the HashiCorp Terraform to OpenTofu fork.
Yeah, and that's complicated by licenses, right? So in some projects, even if it's a hard fork, you can still take code from the other fork. If it's something that still works in your code base and is relevant, you could find security fixes or something if you wanted them. But if your licenses are incompatible or only compatible in one direction, things get really complicated. By incompatible, I mean you're not allowed to take the code from the other project.
An example of that would be Redis and one of the forks like Redict or Valkey, I think. Because Redis is now using a non-OSI approved license, we can't merge changes to Redis into Redict or Valkey or any of the others.
Despite the fact that you can see that code because it is source available.
Right.
I think there's also the changes when you fork something and you either add a new implementation or you do a refactor. There can be times where it's difficult to pull in the upstream changes because your changes are just so different. It's really hard to pull those new things back in. So forking is not always as simple as fork, change, continue with life.
No, and I think it's really easy to underestimate the amount of work that's going on in that original project, which, like, if the fork is done out of frustration that like there's no progress or something like that, you may not be able to see all the work that's going into security fixes or other stuff that you now have to take on.
I think there's also a situation where people might want to fork that we haven't discussed yet. When the original project is dead or dying, I've seen that many times where there's just been no work on that project for 12 years or something, bit of an exaggeration. So someone comes along and forks it and adds new stuff, and suddenly it's that thing -ng or whatever.
Yeah, or Libra, the thing, rather than open the thing.
I would say that's actually been a little bit of a stressor for me in the previous with a open source project that was mildly popular. And just throughout life, having children, changing jobs, I had less time for that thing on the nights and weekends than I did previously. So other people may have said, hey, is this project dead? Is it dying? Can we fork it and move on? Meanwhile, I want to maintain the project that I built up and was proud of. So a looming fork is always kind of a thing to spur me on and be like, hey, I got to do some work. So that can be stressful. However, it turned out in that particular case, I ended up pulling in additional contributors and everything was fine. But sometimes a fork, while not hostile, no one was doing this with malintent or saying, hey, we don't like the work you're doing. It was more of they wanted to continue with the rapid development that I just didn't have time to keep up with. So in that case, I think a soft fork probably could have worked back then where they did the changes that they wanted. And then if those changes were acceptable, merge them back in eventually. However, at least in my case, that ended up not being required.
Sounds like you might call that a fork of Damocles.
But yeah, that whole NG style thing is just really confusing for users, right? Of trying to find what is the latest version. So if we can, as a community, can avoid a kind of unnecessary fork that is just the same thing with a different name, then that would be great, wouldn't it?
We had a confusing one in the Rust community recently. There was a crate that the author was still around. However, they were finding less and less time for it. Somebody forked the code, made it that thing -next, and continued a ton of development on it. Eventually, the original author said, hey, you can have my crate. You can take over it and be the new maintainer. So they did so, renamed their thing -next to just thing, and then re-pushed it back up to the registry with all of the new changes. Well, for me, as a consumer of that, that makes that very difficult because the code now has tons of changes, has a new owner, and even though the project is still named the exact same thing, it looks like just a version bump in my dependency graph. However, a lot has changed under the hood. So some of that can be really messy as well. Now, neither one of the two parties in that case it was not malicious at all, but these things can be messy from a consumer standpoint as well as just a maintainer standpoint on the other end.
So would you count CentOS, the old CentOS before Stream, as a fork? People would call it a rebuild of RHEL, Red Hat Enterprise Linux. But in a way, it kind of was a soft fork, right?
I could see that view because it was the same code byte for byte as RHEL, just with the Red Hat branding removed.
I would say if you called the branding the private patches, then sure. I think if it's just those branding type things that are changed, I think a rebuild is a better term for that, but I could see how it could also be called a fork or a soft fork. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it had a very deliberately extremely minimal scope for changes, right, which is just the branding. So it would be like if you took AntennaPod and just added the refresh button back and then constantly merged everything else.
Call it AntennaPod refreshed.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by people who support us with PayPal and Patreon. Go to linuxdevtime.com/support for details of how you can support us too. Patreon supporters have the option to listen to episodes without ads like this. And it's not just this show. There's Late Night Linux for news, discoveries, audience input, and misanthropy, 2.5 admins about system administration, Linux Matters for upbeat, family-friendly adventures, Linux After Dark for silly challenges and philosophical debates, Hybrid Cloud Show for everything private and public cloud, and Ask the Hosts for off-topic questions from you. You can even get some episodes a bit early. We've got a lot going on, and it's only possible because of the people who support us. So if you like what we do and can afford it, it would be great if you could support us too at linuxdevtime.com/support. It's not always necessarily a great idea to fork something though, especially if that is a reaction. And for me, the classic example of this will always be Glimpse, which was forked from GIMP. Because there was a lot of discussion in the GIMP community about the name and how it was offensive to some people. And I've always maintained it was a terrible name.
Yep.
And GNU Imp would have just fixed the problem.
Yep.
Just let's call it that. But they stuck to the guns and said, no, it's called GIMP. And so a few people got together and forked it as Glimpse, which was effectively a soft fork, right? They just changed the name, but otherwise kept the features the same, is my understanding.
I think they wanted to make some UX changes as well and make it just a more pleasant application in general.
Right. And wanted to being the key phrase there, because it didn't gain enough steam and ultimately it failed. And I think there's a lesson there, right? That it is very hard or can be very hard to maintain a fork.
It's extremely hard. So I don't know how the fork of Audacity is doing.
Which one?
But potentially forks can be done for good reasons, but it's really hard to get mindshare. It's really hard to get people. I can't remember the name of the fork, which I might otherwise use, right?
Tenacity.
That's it. Tenacity, of course. Yeah.
That's at least the one that I still have installed and check up on every now and then.
And what are you recording this in?
Audacity.
Right.
I had an issue with Tenacity at some point a while ago. I haven't used it since.
Didn't want me to shout at you.
Yeah, it's hard to keep up with these with Upstream. It's a lot of work.
Mm-hmm.
In addition to the mindshare, though, I think it's equally difficult. Like, you have to have that differentiating factor more than just a name change usually, or just a license change or things like those are tangible, and I think they could be worthwhile reasons to fork. However, from an end user standpoint, or from, let's say, a software engineering manager standpoint or something, they're going to ask, hey, why are we going through all this trouble to switch to this other thing? Like, what is the reason for this? Is there a new killer feature, new killer set of features, new direction for the project? Are there a ton of bug fixes that actually affect us? If not, just stick on the original thing, because that's what already has the mindshare. So not having that differentiating factor can be difficult to maintain a fork.
Well, the classic example of mindshare has got to be OpenOffice versus LibreOffice.
Uh-huh.
You ask anyone running Linux on the desktop, what should I use as an open source free version of Microsoft Office? They're going to say LibreOffice. But how many normal people out there who just run Windows or Mac or whatever still in 2024 would go and install OpenOffice because that is the name they know as the free office?
Yeah.
I have to wonder, though, if that is also just between the two English words, open and libre. I don't think libre is quite as common, so might not stick in the heads. I don't know. That's just speculation on my part.
Well, I think that if Linux distros didn't bundle LibreOffice, then it wouldn't be popular, would it? You know, you install Ubuntu, or in my case, Ubuntu. If I install the full version, I've got LibreOffice right there out of the box. And so why am I going to bother going and finding something else?
Yeah, so the kind of best case scenario is what's happened with MariaDB, which is a fork of MySQL by a lot of or all of the developers of MySQL, as I understand it. And it got the mindshare to be installed with all the Linux distros. And it seems to have taken over as far as I can see.
Is this the point where I admit to still using MySQL?
Well, my web host still has MySQL, so I'm still using it too.
When I first got started, I remember asking a friend, do I use MySQL or this thing called MariaDB? I have no idea what they are. Which one do I want? And he said MariaDB is just MySQL, but newer. And I said, okay.
Right. It helps that you started about 3 years ago, though.
Yes.
The other one that comes to mind, which I don't actually know what happened with, is anyone here old enough to remember FFmpeg forking into, I think it was called AVConv?
I don't remember that.
That just tingles some neurons, but I can't bring them to full focus.
It got included in Linux distros, and it was expected that it was going to replace FFmpeg. And I don't know whether it then ended up merging back in or not, or whether it failed.
I think the only other big one that comes to mind, which I know nothing about, is the Node.js and IO.js split, and then eventually they merged back in somewhat famously, but that's the extent of my JavaScript knowledge.
I just kept using Node.js and hoped that it all sorted itself out, which it did.
Well, there's also a question as an end user, whether that is just me as an individual or me as my company. What do we do in the case of a fork? Do we continue to use the original or do we move over? And you have to do some assessments. You have to decide, is this fork likely to succeed? Do they seem to have the resources? Do they seem to have the community? Do they seem to have the wind in their sails, as it were? And that's not necessarily an easy thing to do. And inaction, not moving, is an action of itself, but it's often by far the easiest action to take.
I think it depends on the specific project as well, because some projects are live, as in a service. You would pull from that service. You have to use that service live. So if that gets forked and you have to decide whether to point your project at one service or the other, that's a quickly made decision. However, if you're consuming some sort of project privately, chances are you have the time to either just stick on whatever version you're currently on, which would be the original, and decide whether or not you want to spend the calories to move to the fork, and whether or not that's viable in the future going forward. And also whether or not it could be viable to move back to the original and how hard that's going to be. But you have time to make those decisions. And sometimes you can even run experiments on both for a little bit. But that's easier to do when you're not pointing at, like when it's not a service itself that you're consuming. It's more of a thing or a library.
As a desktop user, I tend to just use my Linux distro to help me make the decision, right? So if Tenacity's not yet in the repos, then I'll probably stick with Audacity until it is.
Yeah, but now you've thrown your Ubuntu toys out of the pram and moved to Debian. You're going to be stuck on pretty old versions, probably.
Not that old. Modern Debian is not as bad as when we grew up with Debian and it took like 5 years to make a release.
Yeah, well, that's because it's just been released relatively recently. You tell me the same thing in a couple of years.
It was only 2 years. I was quite often on LTS Ubuntus.
Yeah.
Just come over here to Fedora. The water's great.
That was something I didn't consider for a second. Anyway, I'm talking to you from an Ubuntu box, so so far I've moved 2 laptops that I don't care about over to Debian.
Yeah. And once again, you didn't want me to shout at you by the sounds of things.
But speaking of forks, why not Dev1?
Oh, man. Yeah, that's arguably one of the most infamous forks, isn't it?
And that's over what you could call a technical issue, although it's fairly social, but it's a technical change, right? Of like, we want the old way of doing our startup scripts.
And it's also such a deeply rooted technical change, like down at the lowest levels, that I wonder, I have not looked into this, but I wonder how many changes that requires up in higher levels of the stack and kind of how divergent these two forks become. Not because the original change was big. I would actually say the original change was somewhat minimal.
Staying where they were.
Yeah.
Right, but that could make them diverge quite a bit.
That is the most difficult kind of fork, isn't it? Because the reason why Debian moved, as I understand it, was because it simplified a lot of stuff, so it didn't want to support both.
Well, look at GNOME. That has dependencies on systemd. They basically had to, or they were going to have to do a lot of work to work around that.
Exactly. And then there's other things like the encrypted home partitions that systemd has been working on, which I haven't tried out yet, but it's been on my list of to-dos. But if something like that were to merge and Dev1 was like, hey, we want a feature like that too, how much work would that be?
Well, it seems impossible to do it in any sort of similar way to me. It feels like they would have to just completely write it from scratch.
Which means Dev1 have really got their work cut out. If they don't kind of immediately win the mindshare, then they've got a lot of catch up to do.
At the same time, maybe it's not about winning the mindshare and they can be happy
Yeah, maybe.
using the system in the way that they want it configured and the way that they want it to run, which I think is one of the beauties about Linux and open source is you're not happy with a decision, you don't like something that was put in there. You do have this ability to fork, move your own direction, and stay on your island, happy as a clam. And that's a beautiful thing in my mind.
Well, yeah, it's like we talked about on Late Night Linux recently. Once all the major distros are composable, like Fedora Silverblue style, there are definitely going to be distros that are not composable and are the old-fashioned way of doing it. And there will be people using them and they'll be happy. And that is the beauty of open source. And again, this fundamental idea of being able to fork.
It is the beauty of open source, but the whole fact that you have to keep up to date with security updates kind of breaks that happy world, because if you're stuck on an old version that you don't have the resources to keep up to date, you're going to become more and more insecure.
I think it also depends on whether you are providing your project or your fork to others to consume, or whether you are consuming it yourself privately, or whether, privately could be a corporation here. And if you're providing it to others, I think, yes, that security aspect is probably pretty pinnacle. You should keep up to date with security-wise, inform your consumers that you may be behind on security patches or what have you. But if it's just privately for yourself or for your company and you want to do something super insecure, well, I think that's a bad idea. There's nothing stopping you from doing that.
You can run Windows 95, right?
Exactly.
Right, well, we'd better get out of here then. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. But until then, I've been Joe.
I've been Amalith.
I've been Kevin.
And I've been Andy.
See you later.